Hello and welcome to STM's Crime and Paranormal Podcast. It's your host Ashley, and today we are going to be talking about somebody by the name of Dorothea Puente, otherwise known as the Death House Landlady. Alright, let's get started in on this. So, Dorothea Puente was born on January 9th in 1929. She was born in San Bernardino County, California, to a Jesse James Gray and a Trudy Gray. Born as Dorothea Helen Gray, parents were both alcoholics. She was often abused by both of her parents, and she would have to find her own food at a very young age. So she was scavenging for food at a very young age and went through abuse from both of her parents that were alcoholics. Her father ended up dying when she was only 8, and he died from tuberculosis. And her mother died before she turned 10 years old in a motorcycle accident. After her father died, her mother would lose custody of her 7 children in 1938. And that is when Dorothea would then become an orphan. She would then be sexually abused in this orphanage. Dorothea would be bouncing from relative to relative in foster homes in Napa and Los Angeles in California. Okay? She would often lie about her childhood, stating that she was one out of 18 children and that they were born and raised in Mexico. All right, Mexico. So when she was 16, Dorothea then moved to Olympia, Washington. She then worked as a prostitute to earn money. While she was doing this, she met a man named Fred McFall, whom was 22 years old, and he was a soldier that had just returned from the U.S. after World War II. So in 1995, she married her first husband, which was Fred, and they would move to Gardnerville, Nevada, to start a family. In 1946, Dorothea would give birth to her daughter, and then she had a second daughter less than a year later. One of her daughters was placed in the care of other relatives, and the other one was put up for adoption. So she had no motherly instincts at all. In 1948, McFall split from Dorothea, and it was said he did this after she had suffered a miscarriage. So then she would then move back to San Bernardino, where she would be convicted of her first crime. So we're going to start getting into her first crimes here, besides the prostitution. So she needed money, so she would try to forge checks. Eventually, she was caught, and she was sentenced to a year in jail. Only after 4 months, she only served 4 months of this year, and then she was released. Puente was supposed to stay in the area to serve out her probation, but instead she decided to skip town. Who would have thought? So then Dorothea decided to move to Sacramento. In 1952, she would then marry a man by the name of Axel Johansson. They both started arguing a lot about Puente's drinking and her gambling problems. She would then offer to perform sexual acts on an undercover police officer after she had offered to perform the sexual acts on an undercover police officer. Her then husband, Axel, sent her to a psychiatric ward. Doctors would then diagnose her as a pathological liar with an unstable personality. Even after all of this, their marriage would end up lasting until 1966. So they married in 1952, and that marriage lasted until 1966. So in 1960s, Dorothea had supposedly ran a brothel. Okay. She ended up getting arrested in the brothel and was sentenced to 90 days in the Sacramento County Jail. Once she was released, she was then arrested again, but this time it was for vagrancy. She ended up with another 90 days in jail for this conviction. After her first 2 arrests, she ended up getting involved in other illegal activities that would eventually become more serious, heinous crimes. Dorothea then found work as a nurse's aide, and slowed down on her criminal activities at this time. She would take care of the disabled and elderly in private homes, but would soon go on to manage boarding houses. Okay. So in 1968, Puente would go on to marry another guy by the name of Roberto Puente. These two would end up getting divorced only 16 months later. Shortly after, she had ended up marrying a Pedro Montalvo, and he left only after a week of marriage. Wonder why. So she would provide care and comfort to the homeless of the area that she was living in. Neighbors started noticing something a little off. Here's where stuff started getting noticed. They would notice odd things like a homeless alcoholic man known by the name of Chief. It was stuff that he would do that was off to them. Dorothea had claimed that she had adopted Chief and that he was then her handyman. So she had Chief dig in the basement and take soil and trash away in a wheelbarrow. They then covered the basement floor with a concrete slab. Later on, he would take down the garage that was located in the backyard, and he would lay fresh concrete where the garage was once located. Shortly after, Chief just suddenly disappeared. Gone. Poof. Bye. So in 1976, whenever Puente married, Puente actually ended up marrying Pedro Montalvo in 1966. So I guess 1976. So let me recant that statement where she did not shortly marry Pedro Montalvo after her 16-month marriage with Roberto Puente. It was actually in 1976 that she would marry Pedro. And then he left, a week later. It was said that he was also physically abusive and that he was also an alcoholic. So she started going to a bar where she would spend her time looking for older men that was receiving benefits. So this is like Social Security benefits. This is their pensions, probably disabilities. So Puente would forge these men's signatures so she could steal their money. So this is why she was going to the bar. She was looking for men that were handicapped or mentally disabled or elderly so she could sign their checks and steal their money. Again, Dorothea ended up getting caught, and she was charged with 34 counts of treasury fraud. While she was on probation, she would continue to commit the same fraud that she was caught and charged for. She just never learned her lesson. In 1981, Puente began renting an upstairs apartment at 1426 F Street in downtown Sacramento. This is where she also ran a 16-bedroom boarding house that was below her apartment. In 1980s, a lady by the name of Ruth Monroe, whom was 61 years old, began to live with Dorothea in her upstairs apartment in the early 1980s. So of April of 1982, unfortunately, Ruth would soon die from an overdose of codeine and Tylenol. Puente told the police that Ruth was depressed because her husband was terminally ill, and ultimately, the police believed Dorothea's story and ruled Monroe's death as a suicide. So Dorothea would then inherit $6,000 from Monroe's estate. And we're talking about 1980s. $6,000 was quite a bit in that day. It still is quite a bit. So, I mean, she inherited quite a bit of money from Monroe's death. So a few weeks later, a man by the name of Malcolm Mckenzie, whom was a pensioner and he was 74 years old, would then accuse Puente of drugging him and then robbing him. She was then convicted of 3 charges of theft and got a sentence of 5 years in jail on August 18th of 1982. While Puente was in jail, she would then develop a pen pal sort of relationship with a man named Everson Gilmouth, who was 77 years old, and he was living in Oregon. Dorothea was then released in 1985, so she had only served 3 years of her sentence. When released, Everson was waiting for Dorothea in a red pickup truck to pick her up. This relationship would flourish very quickly, and it is said that they had soon been making plans to get married. So the couple would go on to open a joint bank account and paid rent together at her previous upstairs apartment. So let's go to November of 1985. Dorothea had hired a man named Ismael Flores to install wood paneling in her apartment. Puente would pay an additional $800 for his labor and would give Flores a red pickup truck that was in good condition. Okay. So she told Flores that the truck belonged to her boyfriend, but he would not need it anymore. Afterwards, she asked Flores if he would do one more thing for her, and that one thing would be to build a box that was 6 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet to store her books and other items. Okay. Once he built this box, Puente then asked him to transport the box that was filled up and nailed shut to a storage unit. As Flores and Puente were headed to the storage unit, Dorothea said, abruptly, stop on Garden Highway in Sutter County, and they could just dump the box off on the riverbank. Of course, Flores is puzzled, and he asks why. Well, she responded that the contents of the box were just junk, so they could just be thrown out wherever. They were just junk. Throw them out on the riverbank. So on January 1st of 1986, on this day, a man that was fishing spotted a box that was on the bank of the river. So he informed the police officers. What investigators found in this box was not books and junk. It was a badly decomposed and unidentifiable body of an elderly man. The man in the box wouldn't be identified for 3 years. Dorothea was still collecting Everson's pension and would even write to his family as him, telling them he hadn't been in contact because he had been ill. So Dorothea was still maintaining a room and board, bringing in 40 new tenants. Most of these tenants would be alcoholics and drug addicts. So she was making a decent profit off of this business and started going to more bars to try and find new customers. So more tenants or people that she can steal their checks, forge their checks, get their money. So Dorothea, she was so hungry for money that she would collect her tenants' mail before they got it and would take their money, only giving them a small portion of it. The tenants would go to the nearest bars and would eventually be picked up by the police, and most often would go to jail for around 30 days when they would get these anonymous tips. So they would get anonymous tips about these people in the bars being drunk, and they would go to jail for 30 days. So once this would happen, Puente would collect the rest of her tenants' money. So on November 11th of 1988, this day, police would find a body buried in the lawn of 60-year-old Puente. Dorothea was charged with a total of 9 murders, convicted of 3, and got 2 life sentences. Some of Dorothea's victims were suffocated with a pillow. Her tenants were worth more to her dead than alive, since she could then take all of their Social Security and pension checks instead of giving them a small amount for themselves. So all the tenants that would complain the most would be the ones who were killed and buried in her backyard. So let's talk about one of her victims by the name of Betty Palmer. So one of her victims, which was Betty Palmer, was found in Dorothea's backyard, mutilated. so nobody could identify or reveal her identity. So forensics were able to identify Betty's body, but her missing body parts never were found. So eventually they identified the body, but she was missing body parts and they were never found. Haven't been found. So there was a basement of buried bodies. Neighbors would often complain about a strong smell coming from Puente's yard. Oftentimes the neighbors would say that the smell was sweet and rot. So they would just keep their windows closed. So instead of saying anything, they just kept their windows closed. No reason to be suspicious of a dead smell. So Puente would then start spreading quicklime around her yard. There was a missing person, and the police would arrive to Puente's building to investigate one of her tenants that had just disappeared, vanished out of thin air, nowhere to be seen. This person's name was Bert Montoya. Bert's social worker filed the missing persons report, and his body was also found in the backyard of Dorothea. So once his body was discovered in her backyard, Dorothea tried to flee. The second day that investigators were at Dorothea's house, she said she needed to get some air and get a cup of coffee at a local hotel down the street. So investigators said, okay, but soon realized she hadn't came back to the house. When she was being questioned about Bert's disappearance is when she decided to pack a bag, being a search warrant was also allowing officers to now dig up her yard. A nationwide manhunt was now underway. Dorothea was finally located days later at a hotel in Los Angeles where she had used the name Dorothea Johnson. She ended up getting caught after days of hiding out because she was bored and went to a local bar where she likes to frequent often. She had introduced herself to an older gentleman, but she used the name Donna instead of Dorothea. This man, however, recognized Dorothea from the news and alerted police. She was then apprehended and sent back to Sacramento to await her trial. So, how many people did Dorothea murder? Well, there are 9 deaths confirmed that Dorothea Puente did. Their names are Ruth Monroe, Everson Gilmouth, Betty Palmer, Leona Carpenter, James Gallup, Bert Montoya, Benjamin Fink, Vera Ray Martin, and Dorothy Miller. Before she was convicted of murder, they had thought, again, Monroe had committed suicide. But once they found the bodies in her yard, that thought vanished. They no longer believed that Ruth Monroe had committed suicide. There was 7 that was buried in Puente's house or underneath a concrete slab that was in her backyard. Their deaths consisted of being suffocated or medically overdosed. There has been many other people that have claimed that their loved ones had suddenly went missing while they were under Dorothea's care. So with these claims, there's no telling how many there actually was. But it is a possibility that she murdered upward of 25 people if these claims of missing people were people that were murdered after they had moved into Dorothea's boarding house. So she got her tenants by, like I said, the elderly, the mentally ill. They had drug and alcohol problems. She fooled enough social workers into thinking she was a great person that they would soon start placing their clients in her home. So this is how she was able to keep getting tenants. She was always, and probably the only one that was willing to take on more difficult cases that nobody else wanted. So she took these cases that were more difficult because she knew nobody else wanted them. So more than likely in her head, it was, they're not going to be missed. Nobody's going to notice that they're gone. So in 1992, after she was arrested in 1988 on charges of murder, she finally started her year-long trial with the court. Prosecuting attorney named John O'Mara had 130 witnesses to testify against Puente and would explain her crimes to the jury. John O'Mara, he would tell the jury that she would drug the tenants with sleeping pills and then suffocate them with pillows while they were under the influence and sleeping. However, the defense decided to bring one of Dorothea's daughters to the stand. They would describe Puente's upbringing as sad and would try to convince the jury that she took on tenants that nobody else would want, trying to gain sympathy from the jury. However, Dorothea was found guilty of 3 murders and ended up getting 2 life sentences without parole. She was only guilty of 3, or found guilty of 3, and got 2 life sentences without parole. In 1998, Puente then began speaking with a Shane Bugbee. They did long interviews over the course of several years. She would send him recipes for a book was released by the title of Cooking with a Serial Killer. This book would have a long interview, nearly 50 recipes, and a mix of prison art pieces that were sent to Shane from Dorothea. Dorothea's death, she died on March 27th in 2011 while she was serving her sentences at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. I may have said that wrong, and I apologize if I did. Dorothea was 82 years old and has spent 18 years in prison by this time. Officials say that she did die of natural causes, and Dorothea would continue to state that she was innocent until the day that she died, and that all the people that were buried in her backyard had died of natural causes. So this is the serial killer of Dorothea Puente, known as the House Landlady. There is some crime shows on her, and some documentaries and a movie. I watched a documentary the other day on it, and the people that were investigating her are on there, and they're telling you more about her. So if you want to get more in depth on Dorothea Puente, I would definitely check some of those out. I'll put those down at the bottom and let you guys know what you guys can look for. They were very interesting. Honestly, when I seen this picture of this lady, she looked like a grandma, but at the same time, her eyes were almost cold and heartless. Like, you could tell there was something sinister about her. But if anybody was just walking down the street and seen her, or going into Walmart, seen her walking out of Walmart and looked at her, you would think, okay, it's just a little old lady getting her groceries. She has so much more hidden. And she has such a long criminal history. And again, she was another serial killer that was abused. So, like I said, if you want to get more in depth with what she if you want to watch stuff on her, I will link those below so you guys can see what the media has put out about her. But that is going to wrap up today's episode. Next episode is going to be about another serial killer, and I'll get into him, and we'll see what he's all about. That is going to be all for today, and I hope you liked it. And if you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel to watch these, you are more than welcome to. Again, I try to put out a podcast at least once a week. I can try to do more if possible. But I hope you guys have a wonderful day, a wonderful night, wherever it is that you are in this world, and stay safe.